In working with prose, I have been interested in the slowness of the line as sight of, as Proust writes, momentum and lingering. How can I continue to generate a shapeliness to my novel as momentum and still work vertically, slowly, with the sense of multiple surfaces, the sentence or paragraph as condition rather than event? In terms of my horizontal research subject, it's that the wolf girl is walking into Calcutta in the 1930s. In the history of that era, I find a description of an elderly woman buying eggs in the Muslim quarter. Thus, over and over, 5 pieces in a row, the wolf girl lifts the corners of her apron to accept the placing of eggs. The story, the novel, deteriorating to this image, widening only when I force the wolf girl to start walking, ask a new question. But then, how do I negotiate between the most secret parts of my novel, the deferrals taking place within a sentence, the codes of environment or memory altering from word to word, sound to sound, and the physical obligation of the story moving forwards or backwards in time? A famous novelist read my work and said, "Maybe one day you will write a novel." In thinking of this problem of the shapeliness, perhaps the publishable shapeliness of a novel, I found this quote by Tina Dara useful. "Life as a fragmented subject can be painful, and I find that language has a spontaneous palliative aspect to it. Like endorphins, words and narratives rise up in us to ease the jagged realities of fractured identities." I've asked the writers on today's panel to respond to this question of how they are working with the degenerative and/or restorative aspects of their prose structures. How does their work meet or diverge from the sense of narrative as having a palliative function? More generally, I invite them to share with us what is most interesting or useful to them lately in their prose activities. And we'll begin with Robert.
I'm going to move in and out of some notes that I've been making over the last week, mainly personal notes. And I've come in the last couple of minutes to think of the working title of this as Love and Theft, for reasons that may become obvious later. Perhaps there's a way of taking up on this question about degenerative or restorative forms, but also to touch on the scholarly theme of the week. I'd like to begin by remarking that, like a lot of writers, I've come to think of literature and writing as a conversation with the dead. Specifically, a conversation with the great writers and artists of the past. And we keep them alive by reading them in our own work through the use that we make of them. And obviously, they in turn engender and shape us. Sometimes this conversation with the dead can take the form of scholarship. And I've written 2 books that fit that. My dissertation, which was published in Byron, and a study of James Miller's The Change in Margaret Sandover. And in that latter book specifically, the conversation with the dead was very much a part of the subtext. That poem is about a series of Ouija board exchanges with the dead, many of whom are also writers like Gertrude Stein and Auden and Yeats. But I'm really not primarily interested in major figures like Byron or Merrill. And I'm much more fascinated by kind of marginal and neglected writers and artists. And one of the ways in which I specifically view my work as restorative is that it often literally involves some kind of reclamation project. That was certainly true of the Jim Thompson biography. When I started, he was hardly considered by anybody as an important writer. And it's also true of a book that I'm working on now called Detours, 7 Noir Lives. The 7 lives are of Ouija's, 3 film directors, Edgar Ulmer, Ida Lupino, and Samuel Fuller, and 3 writers, David Goodis, the poet and novelist Kenneth Fearing, and an African-American pulp writer named Clarence Cooper. But it's not just that these lives are marginal, but they're often writers and artists who pitch themselves against the dominant culture of their time. And one brief example will have to do for the whole, but it'll be the example of Ida Lupino. As an actress particularly in movies like Roadhouse, she emerged as a kind of noir icon. But she carefully dismantled her status as an iconic noir actress in a series of women's issue films that she directed and sometimes wrote in the 1950s. Films like Not Wanted, The Hitchhiker, The Bigamist. These are among the earliest examples of independent cinema, and they're formally incredibly fascinating. They're a kind of fictional documentary. And that's how she talked about them in interviews at the time, as a kind of socially driven feature documentary, each term kind of contradicting the one next to it. In a very real sense, these books are acts of scholarship. And I think that writers, myself included, tend to be a bit defensive about scholarship because we've seen academics grind practically everything down to particle board. But I think that scholarship, handled correctly, is really just another way of being precise, and I think we all want to be that. And then I think it involves a respectful attitude towards the past, towards the great dead. By trying to get the past right, I think in a very real sense we're honoring the dead. And I think sometimes this precision is mainly historical, but I find in my own work that just as often it might be called novelistic. I'm fascinated, for instance, when I was writing the Jim Thompson book, by these old street guides that I would find from the 1920s and 1930s. And they were kind of like early versions of telephone books, but they also had a kind of reverse telephone book quality. They would list the person by name at the front, and then they would go street by street through the back at everybody who lived on the street. So you were able to find out who Jim Thompson's neighbors were in 1932, that the apartment that he lived in was in fact over a drugstore. You were able to find out what the name of the nearest bar or tavern was. And then you also find yourself doing work like this when you're working with marginal figures, going down some really kind of untraveled paths. And another example from that book would be, I discovered that Jim Thompson, along with all of his friends on the Oklahoma Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, including Ronald Reagan's favorite novelist Louis L'Amour, were all members of the Communist Party. And that there was a complete kind of overlap between the party and the Writers Project. And that was like utterly neglected and unknown by Oklahoma historians, people who had written entire books on the Writers Project or about socialist movements in the Southwest. Okay, all that said about scholarship, these books really wouldn't interest me at all if they weren't also opportunities for doing real pieces of writing. And in writing all of my prose, all of my nonfiction prose, I think a lot about issues of form and style, about finding a form to fit the lives that my people lead or live. And I felt, and still feel, that there's no reason why nonfiction shouldn't be as inventive or engaged by issues of form and style and structure and craft as fiction.